today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Waukesha, Wea, Miami, Mascoutun, Odawa, Sauk, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed the growth of this institution for the last 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. Welcome. This semester, the university-wide is excited to be partnering with the Diversity Ed and the entire Friday Forum and Conversation Cafe Fall 2021 semester-long series, Unpacking Racism, What Are We Carrying? Just some quick announcements, the Diversity Ed and upcoming events and university-wide. Diversity Ed invites you to join us next Thursday evening, October 21st from 7 to 8 in the Psychology Building, room 32, for our Eye Journey workshop entitled Enhancing Stereotype Awareness. From the university-wide, the Y Global Connections is a student program at the Y that supports introspective dialogue and cross-cultural exchange with our partner, YMCA in Sierra Leone, West Africa. Applications are due October 18th, Monday. To be involved this semester, check out our website or talk to Cynthia for more information. And join us here next week at the same time and place for our Friday Forum and Conversation Cafe with Catherine Shee, an anti-hate training coordinator for the Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Chicago.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I want to also extend a moment of gratitude, thanking our sponsors that make this series possible. First off, the Student Cultural Programming Fee, who provides lunch weekly. Thank you so much to them. Women in Gender and Global Perspectives Programs, Humanities Research Institute, LGBT Resource Center, Women's Resources Center, Education Justice Project, Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Office of the Provost, the Center for Global Studies, First Mennonite Church of Champaign-Urbana, Center for Advanced Study, Latina and Latino Studies, Alina Hillel, College of Fine and Applied Arts, and many more. Today, I'm so happy to introduce our incredible speaker, Karen Sims, who will be presenting Healing Communities, Creating Equitable and Justice Communities Through Trauma-Informed Community Building. Following Ms. Sims, there will be a few minutes for Q&A, and if you're online, please submit your questions throughout her lecture in the chat, and we will collect those. And then if you're in person, there should be a question card either on your table or on your chair, and a writing utensil to jot down your questions, and I will come around and collect those periodically as well. Thank you so much, Karen Sims, for being here with us today. And now I will speak a little bit about her. Karen Sims is an experienced consultant, trainer, facilitator, and coach, and she has a master's degree in marriage and family therapy. She has spent over 30 years advocating for individuals and families who have been marginalized because of ethnicity, gender, health, and socioeconomic status. She is the founder for Trauma and Resilience Initiative, Inc., a not-for-profit that coordinates the community violence response effort in Champaign County and coordinates the SUE Trauma and Resilience Initiative that works closely with the Champaign County Community Coalition. The goals of these efforts are to reduce the impact of adverse community experiences by healing and repairing those who have been impacted by trauma, and to advocate for more trauma-informed practices, policies, and principles. Karen is committed to helping organizations, schools, groups, and communities implement policies, procedures, and practice that engender feelings of safety, trustworthiness, collaboration, power sharing, empowerment, equality, and justice. Thank you so much, and I welcome Karen to the stage.
So if anybody's ever seen me, I'm a mover. So this is going to be like a little bit of a work in progress to be still, so work with me. And we had I'm going to tell you a little bit about my process today. So when I had the invitation, I am typically not somebody who plans in advance, but I actually got the presentation done well in advance, right? Like I was going to do this different. I was not going to be at the last minute, making changes. So that was my commitment. And then last night I was doing a training for a community group out in Indianapolis. And we were talking about healing organizational trauma, right? And so I was reminding them about sort of the history of trauma-informed care, which most people don't know. Most people think that all of the etiology of trauma-informed care kind of grew out of the ACEs study. So people think it's always that it was just about healing trauma. And that wasn't where it came from. So when Roger Hallett and Maxine Harris, who are the people who started really coming up with the core concepts of trauma-informed care, when they started their work, they were actually working with people who were experiencing homelessness. And their work, because they were starting to notice some things, and their work really was about trying to think about what happens in structures, particularly healing structures, that gets in the way of people's healing. Because they realized that most people were harmed in healing structures. And that frequently the systems became part of people's traumas. And so the whole idea about trauma-informed care grew out of transforming structures so that they didn't create woundedness. So I'm sitting with that, and they had amazing questions. And so I woke up this morning at like 6, and I was like, I'm redoing my presentation. So work with me, because one of the things that I was going to kind of do, and I probably will still include a little bit about this, but I was going to talk about some of our local work, and particularly around our community violence response work, because typically that's sort of what people get interested in. And then I remembered, the more I talk about our community violence response work, the more I contribute to my community's trauma. Because the more we sort of elevate and focus on and dwell about it, the more we reinforce an implicit bias that anytime somebody comes up, particularly a brown person, and comes up and talks about something, they're talking about gun violence. And I know my community to be deeper and broader than those experiences. And so I will throw in a little bit about that. The other thing that I was going to do is talk about a project that we're working on that I think is innovative and great. But also, if I'm going to be honest, particularly because the topic here is around unpacking racism, I know that our ability to be transformative is really limited. So, and it's in some ways a misnomer for me to say that it's a healing project when it really does not make an effort to transform the policies, procedures, and practices. So let's try this. See if it'll go. Now it went, right? We knew it went. Whatever happened. See, literally, no one wants me to do this presentation. So I will share. That was so weird because it was looking. All right. So I don't know.
You can try to fix it if you want to keep going.
Okay, yeah. So I'll keep going. So the thing that I wanted to say, that I wanted to start off with, was first a broad understanding of what I see or what I believe is sort of fundamental to the human experience. I believe, and lots of people believe, that human beings need the right to be, become, and belong.
If you want to use the arrows.
Okay, so, right? And traumas of all shapes and form interrupt our ability to be, become, and belong. Does that make sense? And when we think about racism, and I thought I wanted to use a definition, I wanted to be sure we're all using the same language, because a lot of times I think in common culture, racism has been conflated with prejudice, which is to me not the same thing. There are lots of prejudice and biases, and they're not great and wonderful. But racism is an idea, like a prejudice about a group of people, and it is a connection to social and institutional power, right? So it's the connection to both and that to me makes a difference, right? The shortcut is racism is power and prejudice. And we have a variety of different powers, right? So we have our own individual power, we have institutional power, we have systematic power, but it interrupts people's ability to be, become, and belong. Does that work for us? And I think that that's why it is so like impactful. One of the things that we don't talk about a lot that I want to say explicitly is that it not only impacts Black body people and people of color across the diaspora, but it impacts anybody in the planet, right? Like nobody comes out alive when there are things, when there are structures that get in the way of people's becoming, and belonging. And it's connected to this term that has been thrown around recently that I really like, called structural violence. And structural violence is this whole idea that when individuals are denied the right to be, become, and belong, and to get their essential needs met, they are harmed. Right, so this is no passive, it sort of exists in the ether. We actually design structures that are designed to cause harm that become self-perpetuating. Like we don't even have to think about it, because once you put it in the structure, once you build the institution, you could like leave. And you can change the people, you can change the figures, you can even change the policies, and it will exist in the same way because we've created a structure that's self-reinforcing. And I bet you can think about some structures that just sort of keep going. And I hate to be, I'm gonna go back to the original Fallot and Harris's conceptualization. One of those structures that it's self-reinforcing is our helping system. It is not currently designed to heal, liberate, and transform. It is designed to be self-perpetuating. One of the things that women last night reminded me of is that some people love to brag, right? To share in stories when you've got therapists and helpers around. Oh my God, I'm seeing the third generation of X family show up in my program or service. And I said last night, well, then that program and service should be dismantled. Right? We should never be celebrating 3 generations of anybody being in a support system, right? Because then we've designed it wrong. We've actually designed it to be self-perpetuating. So, and again, it's gonna stop again. So the next concept I wanted to introduce us to, now it went way too far, is that structural violence leads to this concept called adverse community experiences. Anybody people have talked a lot about ACEs, but a lot of people haven't talked about this whole idea of adverse community experiences. And it's just another way to think about the manifestation of structural violence. So when we think about people not feeling connected, when we think about the built environment, the buildings, the structure not being feeling safe, looking safe, when you think about breakdown of social norms and relationships and positive community experiences, those are adverse community experiences that become sort of self-perpetuating. But we live in a society and world that now says that when you are experiencing adverse community experiences, that somehow you have created it. I was joking with another group of people recently, and we were talking about public housing. And one of the things, I don't know if people ever know or if you've ever lived in public housing or been in there, but one of the things that public housing does is they typically build a building that looks aesthetically pleasing on the outside, and then they paint it with really cheap paint and that's not meant to last, and they never really invest in good materials, right? And then they'll say, oh my gosh, those people, they move in there and they tear it down, and they can't keep it up and they can't maintain it because you can't touch the walls, right? So they build buildings for children and families, and then they put paint that you can't touch for children and families. And then when the building looks like children and families have lived there, they say, oh, see, this is why we don't give people opportunity, because they tear up anything that we build, right? And then if you live in environments where people say, oh, you don't respect the property, and you don't care, and then you go to school and people say, you are people who don't respect property and don't care, right? It becomes self-reinforcing. And the beautiful thing about what I've come to learn about trauma is I never have to tell you that I don't like you, that I don't believe in you, that you don't matter. You will experience it on a visceral level, even if I never verbalize it. And I can only be, become, and belong in spaces and places that see me. So, right, the problem that we live with. So, I've been really reflecting on these questions for a little bit, because I think, and I'm feeling as someone who grew up, so I'm going to date myself, as someone who was identified as a child of the promise, so I'm 54-ish, and for African-American folks like me who had parents who were civil rights activists, who really were invested, people believed the world was going to be better. I can tell you there are things that my 20-something daughter is experiencing that I would have never in my life experienced. I remember, and I'm going to try to sort of say this agnostically, but I remember after just looking at my mom's face after January 6th, it wasn't the first time I saw it, just pure despair. She's a woman who sacrificed her life to work with low wealth folks. She was a teacher and a social worker. She gave her life to caring and in community. My dad was somebody who started off as an immigrant. He wasn't even a citizen, but really got involved with like the League of Women Voters and voters' rights. And actually, he wanted to run for office, so that's why he acquired citizens. He was a descendant of a Cuban immigrant who was fleeing oppression in Cuba, and a Jamaican person, and they came to the United States for a better life. And he protested and promoted for desegregation and did all of the right things. And here we are at a moment that doesn't feel like I am a child of the promise. And so I've been trying to reflect on what's gone wrong, right? Because that, to me, I think you can't move forward until you do some revision about what's been missing. And that's led me down the rabbit hole of looking at intergenerational trauma and collective healing. And I think one of the things that's gone wrong, and I love this picture for a couple reasons, is that we haven't really thought about the broad and deep impact of what we've lost. I actually feel like that's what keeps us from healing, because no one wants to talk about the pain. And I think we're so deep at a moment that no one wants to deal with pain, is that we have an opioid crisis, right? We've been dealing with that for a while. That really says, I want to numb it out and not feel anything, right? And now people can't take in information that makes them feel uncomfortable, right? I read a study that said teachers don't want to teach about slavery because they don't want to talk about it. Like, what kind of world are we in where people can't talk about things that make them feel uncomfortable or think about things that make people feel uncomfortable? The other thing that I know about trauma is all of the things that we don't deal with go someplace. And frequently it becomes projections out there in the universe. And I think we have other people, good people, bad people, right? So much that we can't belong with each other because right? We've given ourselves permission not to feel uncomfortable. And even if you were a witness, so even if you weren't compliant with the system, there's some guilt and moral injury that comes from just knowing the system exists and that you did nothing. And actually, when we think about trauma and trauma healing and post-traumatic stress disorder, it is that moral injury, the knowing that you should have done something or could have done something and didn't, or did something out of your character, or contributed to a system that was oppressive, that will hang you up mentally, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. So I'm thinking we need to do something different, right? And that part of that moves into the pain. I did want to add, I'm aware of the time, I did want to add a couple of things. It really is being difficult. I want to make sure that when I talk about collective trauma, you know the definition I am talking about, because I believe racism, the experience of racism, is a collective trauma. So we know an individual trauma is a blow to the psyche. It breaks down people's defenses. A collective trauma, on the other hand, breaks down the basic tissues of social life. It damages the bonds of attaching people to each other. It impairs the prevailing sense of community. Collective traumas work their way up slowly and insidiously into the awareness of all those who suffer from it. It is a gradual realization that the community no longer exists as an effective source of support, and that an important part of the self has disappeared. The we no longer exist as a connected pair or as linked cells to a communal body. Does that feel like this moment? There was a time where folks could come together for the collective good, and we could agree to disagree. We could have robust conversations. I was in North Dakota recently, and I was reflecting, I married a libertarian. There used to be a time, right, where those kind of opportunities were not so discordant, right? We could be together and have a sense of we. But I think we have so many collective wounds that the sense of we all have a shared sense of humanity, and I realize that my humanity is connected to your humanity. We've lost that, if we've ever had it, right? But I am aware. And that we know that collective traumas and intergenerational traumas can take, because we know that a little bit about this through epigenetics, there are signs of like depression and anxiety, because we've learned this from the research of following Holocaust survivors, that can show up in the DNA for up to 3 generations. So this isn't, when I talk about our collective woundedness, this isn't sort of an intellectual exercise. This is in our bodies, that we rebel, that we feel afraid, that we disconnect. So what solutions do I have? I want to say this one last thing about that, because I said I wasn't going to talk a lot about community violence, but I did want to share that I want you to now, the next time you hear a story about gun violence, to maybe reimagine that it's not just being about interpersonal conflict, but a symptom of a community's woundedness. We were at a neighborhood meeting and someone said, why can't we just figure this out, right? Like, and I was like, because it's complicated, right? The same way that we just don't figure our way out of poverty, right? Like, you know, why can't we just cure poverty? Because it's complicated. And why would we assume that gun violence would be any less complicated? And I did say, I have a slide in here and I can't make it come up. I do think when I think about our woundedness, it is not just about slavery. There are a lot of truths that we don't talk about, right? We don't talk about our contributions to genocides here and abroad. We don't talk about the long-standing war and the cost to communities, particularly low-wealth communities, of our long-standing wars, where we take so many men and women out of our communities and bring them back wounded without the supports and structures for healing. And we didn't think about the community impact. Actually, when we think about, and again, one of the conversations we rarely happen when we talk about the war on drugs is the drug crisis was a symptom of people coming back wounded from Vietnam and Korea, right? It was a symptom of that we never dealt with. So we had wounded people, disconnected, doing what you do to survive, feeling wounded, trying to parent, right? And then we criminalized, we took those same folks and then we criminalized them, and we said, well, why aren't there men actively involved in communities of color? Because we took 1 in 6 and we sent them away. 1 in 6 men went away to war. And then we criminalized 1 in 4. How can a structure survive if we don't tell the truth? Right? So I want us to, right, we don't tell the truth about our immigration policies, our design of systems, how we created, how we took activists from the 60s and 70s and put them in positions that disempowered them because we put them in organizations where they really didn't have control, but they became tokenized. And then, right, wrong, or indifference, then we really started to, I don't know if you guys know, but low wealth communities are more segregated, fewer people make it out, there are fewer access to social and emotional mobility. Because what we did was we created structures that incentivize people leaving. So there are folks who have never seen, never worked with, never been surrounded by people who work or who have stable families. And then we wonder why you have a sense, because I love people telling me this, people have a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, but we've removed every single social support that would help make people well. And then we say, it's your fault. So I want us to really rethink what a real commitment to healing would look like. And healing is not symptom reduction or treatment, because I don't think it's okay enough to put, right, Band-Aids, that was my last talk, on these wounds, right? So what could we do? It's gonna make me improvise because it's not gonna click. So some of the things that I think that we should do, so there's my definition of healing, it's just gonna come, is I have been talking about and thinking about trauma-informed community building for a while. And anybody who's ever heard my little soapbox around why I love trauma-informed care is I've done sort of human services for 30 years. And for me, it is just an easy way of organizing all of what I know to be best practice in a way that's simple, right? Because I could give you 50 different options, or I could give you 6. So what I like us to imagine is designing or redesigning our work together, our ways of being together, our communities, in a way that we realize, recognize, and respond to intergenerational, historical, and collective trauma, and commit to avoid re-traumatizing them. Can you imagine that? Just simple things, right? You would do the right thing if your commitment was, I'm not gonna do the thing that hurts you ever again. Real simple. Does that transform our law enforcement systems? Does it transform our educational systems? Does it transform our human service systems? If we say, I am going to realize, recognize, respond, and avoid re-traumatizing you. How does that sound? And I'm going to do that by making sure, one, you are always physically and emotionally safe. You know what the best thing to do to address gun violence is to help people not want to have a gun. As long as I feel like I need to protect myself, I'm going to have a gun. And even more messier than that is people will continue to buy guns that I will then have access to steal, to be available in my community. So if we want to really address gun violence, we got to do something about people feeling unsafe so they don't need guns, right? Like that's real at the fundamental. But there are so many different ways that physical structures, what we know is that when people feel stressed out, it's hard to function optimally. It's hard to function mentally. It is, right? I need to feel physically and emotionally safe across the board. I also need policies, procedures, and practices that restore trust and that are trustworthy. And this holds our systems accountable, right? Most people don't know what the rules are that govern their lives. Like, I love reminding folks that all politics are local, because when people fuss about like how a decision gets made and they don't realize like what the local impact of it, or who actually made it, or who has the power to control that, right? That bad paint in public housing, that was somebody's local decision that we could influence, shape, and define. But also, trustworthiness to me when I'm thinking about racism is also telling the truth about racism. I think, you know, when I look globally, truth and reconciliation circles work. They work across the globe where people tell the truth about the harm that was done. And I know from a trauma healing perspective, my healing is connected to you acknowledging that you hurt me, or that people seeing my pain. And folks will act out in all kinds of ways to say, to get you to say that you see me and that you know that I'm hurting. So to me, the trustworthiness is not only just about the structure, but it's also about the truth telling. The other piece around this is voice and choice. Folks need to have power and control over their lives. They need to be able to verbalize, right, what they want for themselves. However, it's a misnomer when we say, tell us what you want and need, when there is access to information, resources that you could share that could help me be an informed decision maker. Because I know, and I'm not picking out the university, but I know folks love to survey people and say, tell me what you think. But there is this whole university of people who've kind of figured out what 50 years of like evidence-based practices look like. And what you should do is help me know that. And then say, how do I apply this for your life? Instead of, I'm gonna generate feedback all day long. I'm never gonna use it because it's not aligned to best practice. Or I'm going to keep shifting and moving every time somebody gives me an idea and never get momentum for change, because all I'm going to do is survey you. Right? That's part of the structures that we create that keep communities disempowered, because real healing means I transfer, I bring it back. Right? There's a lot of complaints about research in a vacuum. If you know something and you don't give me access to it, you are perpetuating the status quo. So don't tell me you're anti-oppression if you've never talked to me. You can't do this work without collaborating. That means you got to talk to sometimes people you don't like. I don't have to consent to everything, but I do have to agree that we together are stronger together. Which means I gotta sometimes get out of ego and power and control. I also have to be willing to collaborate with the people who I have harmed. Right? Because they have some truths they need to tell me, and they have all kinds of wisdom. And then last but not least, we need an empowerment strategy. I'm sorry, I've got one more thing I'm gonna add. This is the original Fallett Harris 5, and then I added a 6. So too often policy procedures and practices are around, again, treatment. They aren't about skill building. And ideally, there are lots of pathways to growth, success. If I do for you and not with you, I've kept you oppressed. And unfortunately, the human service field is filled with great beneficial people who are getting their goodies made from the work. If it is empowerment stance, sometimes you don't feel like you can take all the wins because they aren't yours. Actually, if you feel like you're super successful, then it's probably about you and not about the people you're supporting, because their success should be their own, right? And imagine an empowerment stance for communities and groups and organizations. One of my wishes and fantasies would be that every community would have its own council, and that no funding or program would ever go into a community at need without that community having a council that tells people how to use those resources. So nobody would ever go write a grant and say that this is for these group of people. That we would tell you what would work and who should be hired, and we would set the budget for it. Because I don't think the CEO should make $160,000 and the person doing the work should make $18 an hour, right? Unequitable systems that we keep self-perpetuating. And then the last structure is that we need to have policies, procedures, and practices that are restorative. Because mistakes will happen, but there has to be a way back in, right? And there have to be processes where we can be messy with each other. But we say that no matter how messy it is, that there is always connection and care. And we do that on the community level, on the organizational level, on the system level. which is a loving relational model, right? So those are my, of course, I have more tips and strategies, but I want to allow room for conversation. The last thing to add about collective healing is typically in communities where they really invested, in addition to these things, there are often art, music, practices, rituals, because I mentioned that healing needs to happen in our body, and our coming together needs to be embodied too. So let's think about reimagining communities that are about healing and justice and equity. I do believe that this is a pathway forward, one block at a time, one community at a time. I really should have done this a little differently, because I put a bunch of wishes and fantasies in here, but maybe some of your questions will get to them. So I'm gonna have to put glasses on, but I can read this one. So the first question is one of those things that I was gonna cover. So the question was, what inspiring examples of communities coming together and sharing and showing up for each other have I seen or experienced? So there are a lot of those, right? So the ones that I can think about that really stand up for me, unfortunately, have not happened in the United States. They've been much more global. So when I look at rituals and practices that happened after, again, I think about Rwanda and what got put in place around on a community level to promote healing for people on so many different levels, right? There was both healing and accountability and community building, and they did that on a peer-to-peer level, but they also made sure that they addressed the generational issues. And it led to transformed structures, right? So their legal system transformed, their family systems transformed. On a more local level, there are always little things where, not little things. So I heard last night, I'm gonna use this, a woman told me that several years ago, because she's in Indianapolis, which has a huge problem with gun violence, she decided to create a Facebook group for where she would recognize people who died. So, and other people joined us. So the first year she did it, there were about 120 people that she recognized, and then people in the community came together and they recognized those families, and then they would give them gift baskets and efforts of care. This year, because she included COVID, her list includes over 2,000 families. And while she was in training last night, she got calls from 3 people who had died. And she mobilizes her village, and they go and they witness and they acknowledge and they celebrate each one of those losses. That's the village coming together. And it's where she and all of her friends and her congregation, that's their act of service. And it started off with her just telling a couple people, right? Let's acknowledge those who've been lost. And then I love art, but I'll go to another question. So, but I gotta grab glasses. Hopefully I brought, or I might need a reader. So I might need a reader. I know, let's see. I'm at that age. Thank you. So what has been a local structure that is, what would be a local structure people got harmed by to get needs met, what would the lack of public access to the lack of public access to showers be an example of that? So there are a lot of structures that have harmed people, right, and not met their needs. So for those of you who don't know, right, so everything from how we have provided support or not provided structural support to end homelessness in our community. I think we have a whole system. Okay, I'm gonna try to be polite, but I'm gonna try to be real polite, but we have a real human service system, particularly around poverty, that really has a lot of people who feel really great helping people who are poor, but aren't invested in ending poverty. And actually, if you ask them to do something about ending poverty and not just create like a food bank, there would be rebellion, right? If we said, let's reimagine something different, but we also have had, structural issues. So people don't talk about it, parts of the truth. Champaign schools, consent decree ended only 10 years ago that found that we had not educated kids of color, most of whom you are seeing, right? I promise you, these are the children of the families who were not educated under the consent decree. These are those parents who were wounded by the school system that we keep sending kids to, that we've never fixed or acknowledged harm. We just keep saying, suck it up, because it's all you got. And when people ask for something different, the structures have shut that process down. Because locally, in order to have an alternative option, the schools have to consent to it. Isn't that a beautiful system? The oppressors have to decide if they're going to give you an option. And we wonder why people don't feel safe, because we don't tell the truth. And there are people in those systems. We've had consent decrees around our child welfare system. We've had consent decrees in a whole bunch of systems locally. Little small Champaign has had the federal government say, you have structurally oppressed people, so much so that we have to come in and monitor you. And people feel that, right? I don't even have to tell you that story. People feel that. Or one of my favorite stories that we don't talk about, it's actually not my favorite story, but tongue in cheek. So we had an issue with sex trafficking. I don't know if you guys know, but we had an issue with sex trafficking, actually right around the time I first moved here. So about 10, 15 years ago. And the way that we responded to it as a community is there were lots of videos. All of the girls and women who were involved in it were taped in all of our police departments. Champaign, Urbana, Sheriff, Rantoul watched the tapes. One perpetrator went to jail. The two offenders, right, the two people who ran the ring went to jail. One person who was a client, they watched 500 hours of tape of Black and brown girls being sex trafficked. And then those girls either went to jail or out of town into mental health facilities. And there were over 50 girls involved in that. We never tell the truth. These are mommies of young men and boys in our community right now. So when I talk about the need for healing, I mean, we got to start telling the truth, because we can't keep blaming victims for their own oppression. So I think maybe I can get one more. if there's a place where I live where I can be and belong, what is that? And what created that space? Oh, I love that question. So I am fortunate, I'm going to say that I have an extended family network that is from a small town in Florida that you can only identify by looking at a local map. So my extended family network migrated, particularly my mom's side, they migrated from Mississippi because my great-grandfather killed someone protecting his wife, who had sexually assaulted his wife. So they migrated with the help of Seminole Indians to a small town called YMCA, Florida, that is primarily still Seminole Indians. And it also has a large, it's changed demographically, but it's called YMCA. And I can go to YMCA, which is outside of Tampa, and many cousins and extended family members are still there. And I feel like I can become and belong there because although I have left and most of the folks in my family did not leave, I'm one of the few people who left. I have an uncle who's currently incarcerated and he just said this to me. He said, I love seeing you, right? And what he means by that is he just appreciates all that Karen is, that he knows all of my messy stories. He remembers my childhood. He remembers the braces. He remembers the awkwardness. He remembers my cousins making fun of me because I always had a heavy backpack. I was the nerd kid. And my cousins would always say, I never want to be that kid who has to carry around the heavy backpack. But he sees me, and in that space, I can be my authentic self. Because most of the time I'm code switching, right? I'm moving in and out. But in that space, regardless of class or economics, I can fully show up. And I wish that for everyone. And I know as families become more fragmented, where there's so much migration, where there are people who've lost their sense of extended networks, there aren't those spaces for many people. One of the things through our Healing Communities project that we do is we try to rebuild that sense of social connection. One of my wishes for every single family that we work with, it's why we love the wraparound model, is that we believe in repairing a village. So there is a loving network of people who are not paid to be with you so that you can, as you journey through life, know you have people who have your back unconditionally. Because the folks that we meet who are vulnerable feel like they are so alone and that they have to carry the load. So that's our commitment. Our little pebble in the water is that we want everybody to have at least a sacred space where they can be, become, and belong authentically. So that's our Healing Communities work. So I know I'm out of time, but trying to think of what else I could tell you about that project. It is super exciting. It is super small. It was part of COVID relief response. And we've had people, we've got seniors who are involved. So we are wisdom leaders and they have been amazing, talking and engaging other folks over 55 about what they need and what they see. And again, what we hear from people over 55 is how isolated they are. And then the other thing that we've seen and known when we think about witnessing, again, these are my people because I'm their age, but is how many folks who are between the ages of 55 and 65, like that pre-Social Security, who have no one. For no financial support, no resources, disconnected from care, disconnected from extended family. And so we've been now trying to meaningfully think about how do we meaningfully engage, rebuild, reconnect them to maybe family or each other, because they're part of our community's woundedness, right? So thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure. I'm with the Trauma and Resiliency Initiative. If you ever want to get involved, find us on all of the social medias. We'd love to have you, and we are always, because we're a not-for-profit, always looking for volunteers and help. My board president is like, yes, help. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karen, for coming and sharing your time with us. I just want to urge you all to join us next week. We will have Catherine Shee here. And we also want to bring attention to the QR code on your seats. It is an evaluation of this lecture and the entire series to give us some of your feedback. Thank you. We'll see you next week.